Captain Blixtar adjusted his ceremonial shoulder plates for the third time in 10 minutes, trying to project an air of competence he didn't quite feel. The hegemony security forces had assigned him what they called a routine extraction on Nexus 7, which was bureaucratic speak for go arrest the idiot human who thinks she can smuggle contraband through our most secure trade hub. "Listen up, you glorified mall cops," Blixtar announced to his squad of 6 officers, each one looking about as enthusiastic as a wet towel. "Today we're dealing with a Class D Deathworlder. Species designation, human. Threat level, laughably minimal." Officer Krell, whose idea of tactical thinking involved which end of his plasma rifle to point at things, raised a tentacle. "Sir, why are they called Deathworlders if they're not dangerous?" Blixtar sighed the kind of sigh that suggested he'd explained this 17 times already. "But because they come from a planet that could theoretically kill other species, Krell." Emphasis on theoretically. "These particular Deathworlders are about as threatening as a gentle breeze on Century Prime." He pulled up a holographic display showing Earth's statistics. "Look at this pathetic gravity well they evolved in. 9.8 meters per second squared. My grandmother could survive that in her sleep." The squad gathered around the display, pointing at various data points with the kind of scientific curiosity usually reserved for examining something stuck to the bottom of their boots. According to their databases, humans were classified as soft-tissue Deathworlders, which was essentially the galactic equivalent of participation trophy in the Dangerous Species Olympics. "Target designation Maya Torres," Blixtar continued, bringing up a surveillance image of a brown-haired human female who looked about as menacing as a houseplant. Age 27 standard cycles, occupation listed as freelance logistics coordinator, which we all know is smuggler speak for I move things that shouldn't be moved. Intelligence reports suggest she's been running small-time contraband through the Outer Rim for about 2 years. The briefing room filled with the kind of confident chatter that comes from beings who have never actually met a human but have read about them extensively in poorly written intelligence reports. Someone mentioned something about humans being emotionally unstable but physically weak, while another officer noted that their species apparently couldn't even see properly in low-light conditions. "Non-lethal force is authorized and frankly preferred," Blixtar announced with the swagger of someone who had never seen a human do anything more dangerous than breathe. "Command wants this one taken alive for questioning. Apparently, she might have information about larger smuggling operations." He paused dramatically, looking around the room with the kind of smile that suggested he thought this assignment might actually be fun. "Questions? Should we bring the heavy restraint equipment, sir?" asked Officer Venth, whose species had evolved from something resembling a nervous jellyfish. Blixtar actually laughed out loud. "For a human? Venth, these beings break bones falling downstairs. Standard pacification gear will be more than sufficient. We'll probably spend more time filling out paperwork than actually apprehending the target." The squad exchanged glances that suggested they were either completely confident or completely clueless. In the hegemony security forces, those two states were often indistinguishable. "All right, people," Blixtar said, checking his chronometer. "Maya Torres is currently holed up in docking bay 94, apparently trying to repair her ship's engine. The intelligence suggests she's unaware we're onto her operation. This should be easier than explaining quantum mechanics to a Rigelian." As they filed out of the briefing room, each officer made mental notes about which taverns they'd visit after this incredibly routine assignment was completed. After all, how dangerous could one small human possibly be? The deployment to docking bay 94 went exactly as planned, which should have been the first warning sign that something was about to go spectacularly wrong. Blixtar's squad moved through the corridors of Nexus 7 with the kind of tactical precision that would have been impressive if they weren't essentially armed mall security that are approaching what they thought was a lost tourist. Each officer carried standard pacification equipment, plasma rifles set to stun, electromagnetic restraints rated for Class C species, and enough confidence to power a small space station. The kind of gear that worked perfectly fine on every other species in the galaxy, assuming those species had evolved in what humans would generously call tutorial mode. They reached the docking bay and found Maya Torres exactly where intelligence said she'd be, elbow deep in her ship's engine compartment, muttering words that the universal translator kept flagging as creatively profane. She was wearing standard mechanic coveralls that were stained with enough different fluids to qualify as abstract art. Maya Torres, Blixtar announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had successfully arrested dozens of completely non-dangerous individuals. Hegemony security forces. You're under arrest for violation of trade regulations and suspected smuggling activities. What happened next should have been a textbook example of routine law enforcement. Maya straightened up, turned around, and raised her hands in what appeared to be the universal gesture of surrender. She even smiled, which according to their cultural briefings was supposed to be a friendly expression among humans. "Oh, hey there," Maya said, her tone casual enough to suggest she'd been expecting them. "I was wondering when you guys would show up. Your surveillance drones aren't exactly subtle." Blixtar practically preened. This was going even better than expected. He keyed his radio with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for someone who had just solved a puzzle designed for children. "Command, this is Blixtar. Target acquired without incident. Beginning processing procedures." The response came back immediately. "Copy that, Blixtar. Nice work. Command out." "All right, Maya Torres," Blixtar said, gesturing for his squad to move into standard arrest positions. "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning. This can be easy or it can be difficult. The choice is yours." Maya nodded agreeably, still maintaining that friendly smile. "Oh, absolutely. I'm totally cooperative. Just want to make sure I understand the parameters here." She paused, and that pause should have set off every alarm bell in every officer's head. "When you say this should be easy, and I see you're all carrying weapons, I'm assuming we're talking non-lethal force only, right?" Officer Krell started to answer, but Maya held up a hand. "Sorry, let me be more specific. Non-lethal means I shouldn't kill anyone, right? Just want to make sure we're on the same page here." The docking bay fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral services or really awkward dinner parties. Blixtar felt his confidence wobble slightly, like a three-legged table supporting too much weight. "Why?" Officer Venth asked slowly, his voice carrying the kind of tremor that suggested his survival instincts were finally waking up. "Would you need clarification about not killing us?" Maya's expression shifted to something that might have been confusion, or might have been pity. It was hard to tell. "Well, because you're pointing weapons at me and I was told this was a non-lethal operation. I just want to make sure I'm following the rules properly." The squad exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing realization that maybe, just maybe, their intelligence briefings had left out some rather important details. Officer Krell's plasma rifle suddenly felt heavier in his hands, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Look," Maya said, taking a step forward with the kind of casual movement that somehow made 6 armed officers instinctively take a step back. "I think there might be some confusion here about what constitutes appropriate force levels." Officer Krell, bless his simple heart, decided this was the perfect moment to demonstrate proper arrest procedures. He raised his plasma rifle and pointed it directly at Maya's center mass, his finger hovering over the trigger with the confidence of someone who had successfully stunned dozens of compliant civilians. "That's far enough," Human Krell announced. "Maintain your distance and prepare for restraint application." Maya looked at the plasma rifle with the kind of expression usually reserved for examining a particularly interesting bug. "Oh, that's a Mark 7 plasma rifle, isn't it? Nice piece of equipment." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Mind if I take a look at it?" Before anyone could process what was happening, Maya reached out and gently took hold of the rifle's barrel. Not grabbed, not snatched, just took hold of it, like she was accepting a handshake from a polite acquaintance. "Wait, what are you doing?" Krell asked, his voice climbing several octaves into what could generously be called panic territory. "Just examining the craftsmanship," Maya replied cheerfully. Then, with the same casual effort most beings would use to bend a piece of wire, she folded the plasma rifle in half. The metallic screech that followed was the sound of military-grade titanium alloy being treated like a particularly stubborn piece of origami. The rifle, which had been designed to withstand atmospheric re-entry and direct asteroid impacts, now resembled a very expensive boomerang. Officer Krell stared at his former weapon with the kind of expression usually reserved for beings who had just watched their entire understanding of physics pack up and leave for a better universe. That's not possible. Oh, sorry about that, Maya said, handing the twisted remains back to Krell with genuine apologetic concern. I probably should have asked first. It's just that Deathworlder muscle density is about 8 times higher than standard galactic average. We evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill us, so our bodies had to get creative about survival. The docking bay filled with the kind of silence that accompanies profound existential realizations. Blixtar felt his species' equivalent of cold sweat beginning to form on his carapace. 8 times, Officer Venth repeated slowly, like he was trying to convince himself he had heard wrong. Give or take, Maya confirmed helpfully. Depends on which muscle groups we're talking about. Grip strength is usually the real surprise for most species. But she gestured toward Officer Thane, who was holding a pair of stun batons. Those look interesting. Are they the new sonic pulse models? Thane looked down at his stun batons, then back at Maya, then at the pretzel that used to be Krell's rifle. His survival instincts, which had been napping peacefully for most of his career, suddenly woke up and started screaming. Please don't touch my weapons, Thane said, backing away slowly. I'll be gentle, Maya promised, reaching out with that same casual movement. The stun batons, which were rated to incapacitate beings up to Class B threat levels and were constructed from the same titanium alloy as starship hulls, made a sound like aluminum cans being crushed when Maya gave them a gentle squeeze. They crumpled in her hands like discarded food wrappers, their internal components sparking briefly before going dark. Fascinating design, Maya commented, examining the compressed remains. Though the power coupling seems a bit fragile for field use, Blixtar's mind was performing calculations at speeds that would have impressed a quantum computer. 8 times normal muscle density. A casual destruction of military equipment, cheerful attitude while demonstrating the ability to crush their weapons like children's toys. Command, he whispered into his radio, his voice barely audible. We might need to revise our threat assessment. You say again, Blixtar? Came the reply. You're breaking up. Maya looked over at him with polite interest. Oh, are you calling for backup? That's probably smart. Though just to reiterate, I'm totally cooperative here. I just want to make sure everyone stays safe. Blixtar's training kicked in with all the effectiveness of a broken life support system. According to the manual, when standard equipment proved insufficient, the next logical step was to escalate to heavy restraint protocols. What the manual had failed to mention was what to do when your target treated military-grade weapons like arts and crafts supplies. Deploy the titanium restraints, Blixtar ordered, his voice cracking slightly, and someone get the neural inhibitor ready. Officer Venth, who was beginning to question every career choice that had led him to this moment, pulled out a set of restraints that looked like they could hold a small starship. The titanium alloy cuffs were connected by a chain that could theoretically anchor a space station, and the whole assembly hummed with electromagnetic energy designed to suppress neural activity in most known species. Oh, those look heavy-duty, Maya observed, her tone carrying the kind of genuine interest usually reserved for examining particularly clever engineering. Are those the Mark 12 restraints? I've heard good things about the electromagnetic suppression field. Just hold still, Venth stammered, approaching Maya like she was a particularly unstable explosive device. This will only take a moment. Maya obligingly held out her hands, watching with fascination as Venth carefully applied the restraints. The electromagnetic field activated with a satisfying hum, and for a brief, shining moment, Blixtar thought they might actually have this situation under control. Then Maya stretched. The sound was like someone tearing construction paper, if construction paper was made of titanium and cost more than most officers' annual salaries. The restraints simply came apart in her hands, the chain links separating with gentle pops that sounded almost apologetic. "Huh," Maya said, examining the broken restraints with scientific curiosity. "The tensile strength on these isn't quite what I expected. Though I suppose if you're designing for standard galactic physiology, this would be more than adequate." She looked up at the increasingly pale faces surrounding her. "Sorry, I probably should have warned you that electromagnetic fields don't really affect human muscle tissue. Different biology, you know." Officer Krell, who was still mourning his twisted plasma rifle, made a sound that might have been a whimper. "How is this possible?" "Those restraints are rated for class of threat levels." "Well, here's the thing," Maya began, settling into what appeared to be educational mode while absent-mindedly tying the remnants of the restraint chain into a small bow. "Your classification system is based on species that evolved in relatively stable environments. Low gravity, mild atmospheric pressure, minimal predation. You're basically the galactic equivalent of house cats trying to restrain a grizzly bear." She paused, looking genuinely concerned. "Not that I'm comparing you to house cats. That would be rude. You're obviously much more intelligent than house cats." "Well, most of you are." Blixtar felt his worldview crumbling like a poorly constructed sand castle. Here was a being who could apparently tear apart their most advanced equipment with her bare hands, and she was worried about being rude. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a plasma torch, assuming Maya didn't crush the plasma torch first. "Look," Maya continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to particularly slow children, "I really don't want to hurt anyone here. That's why I asked about the non-lethal thing. But your equipment has some serious design flaws." She picked up the neural inhibitor that Officer Venth had dropped in his haste to back away from her. The device, which resembled a metallic headband covered in blinking lights, looked absurdly small in her hands. "This neural inhibitor, for example," Maya said, turning it over like she was examining a piece of jewelry. "The frequency modulation is all wrong for human brain chemistry. Plus, the power coupling is externally mounted, which makes it vulnerable to physical damage." To demonstrate her point, she gently pressed her thumb against the power coupling. The device made a sad electronic wheeze and died, its lights fading like a disappointed firework display. "See? One small pressure point, and the whole system fails. You really want to internalize these components for field reliability." The squad watched in horrified fascination as their advanced technology was systematically critiqued and casually destroyed by someone who was apparently trying to be helpful. It was like watching a toddler accidentally demolish a carefully constructed model while trying to give it a hug. "Captain," Officer Thane whispered, his voice barely audible, "what exactly are we supposed to do here?" Blixtar stared at Maya, who was now examining the broken neural inhibitor with the kind of professional interest that suggested she might actually be considering improvements to the design. Their most sophisticated restraint equipment had lasted approximately 30 seconds against what their databases insisted was a soft-tissue Deathworlder. Maya noticed the growing expressions of existential dread on her captors' faces and apparently decided this was the perfect time for an educational seminar. She settled herself comfortably on a nearby cargo container, still holding the remains of their neural inhibitor like a professor with a visual aid. "You know what I think the real problem is here?" Maya began, her tone taking on the enthusiastic quality of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. "Your species never had to deal with what we call evolutionary pressure. Let me break this down for you." Officer Venth made a small noise that might have been protest, but Maya was already warming to her subject. "Take gravity, for instance," she continued, absently bending the neural inhibitor's metal casing into a small sculpture while she talked. "Your homeworld probably has what, maybe 6 meters per second squared? 7 at most? That's adorable. Earth clocks in at 9.8, which means every single day of our lives, we're essentially doing strength training just by existing. The metal casing, which had been designed to withstand electromagnetic pulses and direct energy weapon strikes, was now shaped into what appeared to be a tiny flower. Maya held it up admiringly before setting it aside and reaching for another piece of equipment. Then there's atmospheric pressure, she said, picking up a scanner that Officer Krell had been using to document evidence. Your species probably evolved at what? Standard galactic atmospheric pressure? 0.8 standard units? Maybe 0.9? The scanner made a soft crunching sound as Maya used it to illustrate her point. Earth's atmosphere is 1.03 standard units, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that every breath we take is basically a low-level resistance exercise for our entire respiratory system. Blixtar watched his expensive scanning equipment transform into an abstract art piece and felt something inside his chest that might have been his will to live giving up. We're starting to get the picture, he said weakly. Oh, but that's just the beginning, Maya said cheerfully, now working on what appeared to be a communications device. The real fun starts when you factor in predator evolution. See, most of your species probably evolved from prey animals, right? Grazers, maybe some omnivores in low-competition environments? The communication device was now being folded into what looked like a paper airplane. If paper airplanes were made from military-grade electronics and cost more than a small moon's gross domestic product, humans, Maya continued, evolved from persistence hunters on a planet that was actively trying to murder a US 24 hours a day. Gravity that could crush most species, atmospheric pressure that would implode your lungs, predators that could bite through steel, weather patterns that could flash freeze or boil you alive, and plants that were so toxic they could kill you just by touching them. Officer Thane made a sound like a deflating balloon. Your planet was trying to kill you? Oh, constantly, Maya confirmed with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. We had to become incredibly durable just to survive childhood. Enhanced bone density, redundant organ systems, muscle tissue that could generate enough force to break our own bones if we weren't careful. She paused in her equipment destruction to gesture at the squad. Which is why I keep asking about the non-lethal thing. I don't want to accidentally hurt anyone. The irony of this statement, delivered while surrounded by the twisted remains of their most sophisticated equipment, was not lost on anyone present. That was when backup arrived. The docking bay doors burst open with a dramatic hiss, and 6 more officers rushed in carrying what the hegemony classified as heavy weapons. Plasma cannons, particle beam projectors, and something that looked like it could punch a hole through a small asteroid. Maya looked at the new arrivals and their impressive arsenal, then turned back to Blixtar with an expression of genuine disappointment. Really? She asked, her voice carrying the kind of patient exasperation usually reserved for dealing with particularly stubborn children. I just spent 10 minutes explaining basic physics and evolutionary biology, and your response is to bring bigger guns? She sighed, the sound somehow managing to convey decades of weary disappointment with galactic civilization's collective inability to learn from obvious demonstrations. I thought we were making progress here, Maya said, shaking her head sadly. But apparently the concept of exponentially increasing the potential for accidental harm didn't really sink in. The new officers looked around at the twisted remains of their colleagues' equipment, then at Maya sitting peacefully on her cargo container like a teacher, waiting for her students to figure out an obvious answer. Sir, one of them whispered to Blixtar, what exactly happened to all your gear? Blixtar looked at his twisted plasma rifle, his crumpled restraints, his origami scanner, and his flower-shaped neural inhibitor. The backup squad's leader, a particularly dense specimen named Commander Thexnal, stepped forward with the kind of swagger that suggested he had not been paying attention to the impromptu physics lecture that had just concluded. All right, human, Thexnal announced, hefting a plasma cannon that looked like it could vaporize a small building. Surrender now, or we'll be forced to use lethal measures. Maya looked at him with the expression of someone watching a child try to intimidate a thunderstorm. You know, I really tried to explain this gently, but apparently, subtlety isn't working here. She stood up from her cargo container with fluid grace and walked over to Thexnal, who was suddenly reconsidering his life choices as she approached. Without breaking eye contact, Maya reached out and gently placed her hand on the barrel of his plasma cannon. "This is a Mark 15 heavy plasma projector," she said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. "It's designed for anti-vehicle operations, capable of punching through 3 meters of reinforced concrete." Then, with the same casual effort she might use to crumple a piece of paper, Maya began folding the plasma cannon. The weapon, which weighed approximately 200 kilograms and had been forged from the strongest alloys known to galactic science, bent like warm plastic in her hands. "The main weakness," Maya continued, now shaping the former weapon into what appeared to be a decorative swan, "is that the power conduits run along the exterior housing. One good squeeze, and she applied gentle pressure, and the cannon made a sad electronic wheeze before dying completely." "Well, you get the idea." Thexnell stared at his plasma cannon, which was now an art installation, and made a noise like a small animal in distress. "Anyone else want to contribute to our impromptu modern art exhibit?" Maya asked pleasantly, looking around at the remaining officers who were all suddenly finding the floor very interesting. The standoff that followed was less of a standoff and more of a group therapy session for beings experiencing collective existential crisis. 12 heavily armed officers stood in a semicircle around one human who had apparently just redefined their understanding of what constituted a threat. "Look, here's a thought," Maya said, settling back onto her cargo container. "Instead of continuing this increasingly expensive demonstration of why your weapons aren't designed for Deathworlder interaction, why don't we just sit down and have a civilized conversation? I make excellent coffee, and I think we could all use some caffeine right about now." Blixtar, whose worldview had been so thoroughly demolished that he was essentially starting from scratch, managed to find his voice. You want to have coffee? With us? After we tried to arrest you?" "Well, yeah," Maya said, looking genuinely confused by his confusion. "That's kind of why I'm here in the first place. I was hoping someone would arrest me." The silence that followed this statement could have been bottled and sold as a therapeutic aid for insomniacs. "I'm sorry," Officer Venth said slowly. "Did you just say you wanted to be arrested?" Maya nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, absolutely. See, I accidentally filed the wrong customs declaration for my last cargo run. Listed my shipment as recreational pharmaceuticals instead of medicinal herbs. Technically, that's smuggling, and I believe in following proper legal procedures." She gestured around at the twisted remains of their equipment. "I've been trying to turn myself in for 3 weeks, but every time I approach a security station, everyone starts running away for some reason. I figured if I just stayed put long enough, someone would eventually come arrest me properly." Blixtar felt the last vestiges of his sanity pack their bags and head for the exit. "You destroyed our equipment because you wanted to be arrested for a filing error?" "Oh no," Maya said, looking genuinely apologetic. "I destroyed your equipment because you kept pointing it at me after I specifically asked about non-lethal protocols. The arrest thing is completely separate." Commander Thexnell, still holding the twisted remains of his plasma cannon, made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been the beginning of a complete psychological breakdown. 3 hours later, Blixtar sat in his office staring at the most challenging document he had ever encountered, the incident report. How exactly did one explain to command that a routine arrest had resulted in the complete destruction of 12 weapons, 6 restraint systems, and 1 officer's sanity, all while the suspect cheerfully provided educational commentary and offered refreshments? The equipment loss, he typed slowly, occurred due to fundamental misunderstanding of Deathworlder physiology. He paused, deleted that, and tried again. Target demonstrated unexpected resistance to standard pacification protocols. Delete. Human broke everything and we had coffee about it. Delete. His communicator buzzed. Blixtar, this is command. We're reviewing your preliminary damage assessment, and frankly, we're having trouble believing these numbers. Did you really lose 14,000 credits worth of equipment to one unarmed human? Blixtar looked out his office window at the docking bay, where Maya was now sitting peacefully in proper diplomatic custody, sipping coffee and chatting amicably with the cultural attaché who had finally been called in to handle the situation properly. She appeared to be teaching him how to fold napkins into small animals. Affirmative, Command, Blixtar replied. Though in our defense, the human was apparently trying to surrender the entire time. We just didn't know how to let her. The response was a long silence, followed by what sounded like someone hitting their head against a desk repeatedly. Within a week, the hegemony had implemented new protocols for Deathworlder interactions. The guidelines were surprisingly simple. Step 1, ask politely. Step 2, listen to the answer. Step 3, under no circumstances attempt to physically restrain a Deathworlder unless they specifically request it. Step 4, always have coffee available. Maya's paperwork error was corrected with a small fine and a formal apology from the hegemony for the misunderstanding. She was also offered a consulting position helping to redesign their equipment for enhanced durability requirements, which she accepted with enthusiasm. Blixtar, meanwhile, found himself promoted to the newly created position of Director of Deathworlder Relations. It's a job that mainly involved explaining to other officers why their weapons were not adequate for beings who had evolved in what the scientific community was now calling nightmare mode. As he watched Maya's ship depart from Nexus 7, her cargo hold full of properly filed medicinal herbs and her pilot's license bearing a small addendum that read approach with respect and adequate coffee supplies, Blixtar reflected on the day's events. The galaxy, he realized, was a much more interesting place than their databases had suggested. Most species had spent millions of years evolving in relative comfort, developing sophisticated technology to compensate for their physical limitations. Humans, apparently, had spent the same time period getting really good at breaking things with their bare hands. It was, Blixtar thought as he began drafting his resignation letter from field operations, probably the most educational day of his career. And definitely the most expensive. The universe, as always, had the last laugh.